now we're going to explore lessons learnt from the crisis and focus on vulnerabilities, but also opportunities for the EU agri-food sector. So I'm going to invite to join me, I'm putting my hand in my pocket for a reason, at the requisite social distance, my fellow moderator, Florence Ranson. Thank you. So, good afternoon, and I'm going to look a bit... Welcome to you. It's so delightful. I'm going to look down that camera lens just to make the audience know that we still have you in our minds. Absolute boost to have a human presence in the vicinity. Absolutely. Now, this second session is yours to guide. It springs from the immortal words of Winston Churchill. In case you don't know, never let a good crisis go to waste. In an absolute nutshell, because time is of the essence for you, what are you going to explore?
We're going to look with our speakers at, indeed, as you pointed out, the opportunities that may have come out of the crisis. We'll hear from their experience. They will paint for us the various vulnerabilities that have emerged from the crisis over the last few months, but also look at the future and be a little more optimistic, hopefully, in terms of how they've coped and what might result in the end into something a little more positive.
Thank you, and I hope that we might hear that optimism and positivity reflect what we heard from our high-level opening speakers. Let's see.
So.
Let's see. I will pop back at the end. I will leave this in your very capable hands, and I will see you in not too long. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Katrina. And now that we don't have to stick to our distances anymore, I can take off my mask and welcome you all to this session. It is indeed the first panel debate of our whole conference, and we will, during the session, be running 2 Slido polls. So when the time comes, I will get back to you, and I will ask you to connect to slido.com on your phone, on your computer, and to enter the hashtag AgriOutlook so that you can vote and participate in this poll. The slide will come up when the time comes, but I'm warning you already so that you can prepare. Now, the time has come to turn to our distinguished speakers, whom I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon, and starting with our keynote speaker who will be opening the session, Ms. Beth Bergdol, who's the Deputy Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Good afternoon. Mr. Giovanni Guarneri. Giovanni is the Head of Office of the Italian Dairy Cooperatives. Hello, Giovanni. I don't have you on screen, but I'm sure you will appear very soon. There you are. Ms. Lonneke Knipscheer, who's the lead partner for the supply chain and network operations at Deloitte. Mr. Marcel Weber, who's head of buying private labels for the Rewe Group in Germany. And finally, Mr. Michael Scannell, who is the Deputy Director General of the Directorate General for Agriculture and Rural Development at the European Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. As I said, I will first turn to our keynote speaker and ask Beth Bergdol to give us the macro perspective, to give us an overview of these vulnerabilities that may have emerged, in particular during the pandemic that we're going through. So, Ms. Bergdol, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Florence, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here to discuss some of these lessons learned. I do have a few slides that I believe the organizers had perfect. You can go to the next slide, please. So I think before we even begin a discussion of COVID-19, we have to remind ourselves of the other enormous challenges the global food and agriculture system has been tackling. Evidence shows that almost 690 million people in the world, or approximately 9% of the world's population, are considered undernourished. Another 650 million people are considered obese. 10% of the world's population live in extreme poverty, and more than 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. and existing crises, such as conflict, man-made oftentimes, I would add, natural disasters, climate change, pests, and plagues are stressing our food systems and triggering food insecurity around the globe. Next slide. And now we have COVID-19. In such a short period of time, it has affected every one of us around the world. The current pandemic and economic crisis are developing in a period where the number of acutely food insecure people around the world has grown over the past 4 years. And in times of COVID, this trend, sadly, will not likely be reverted. In fact, while the medium and longer term impacts of the outbreak are yet to be fully understood, it is clear that developing countries especially will be heavily impacted for some time to come. The economic slowdowns in these particular countries and the subsequent decrease in disposable household incomes is expected to lead them to a significant reduction in demand for agricultural commodities, with a real threat of a rise in food prices. Using 3 different scenarios, what I would call bad, worse, and worst, it is estimated in the 2020 SOFI report that the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to an additional 83 to 132 million people undernourished around the world, depending on economic growth forecasts for this year and next. Simultaneously, according to estimates by us, FAO, and the World Bank, the pandemic's economic impact could push between 70 and 100 million people or more into extreme poverty. Next slide. The reduction in GDP worldwide will also pull fiscal revenues down. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is particularly relevant for those weaker economies that will not have the possibility to continue consumer and producer support measures without external aid. Furthermore, and depending on the economic strength that comes back, high import dependent countries with little opportunity to substitute food with regional or local production will be particularly hit. This will be particularly relevant to small island developing states, where inbound tourism accounts in many places for more than 60% of GDP. And in fact, these countries also spend a large share of their earnings on food imports. And lastly, an overall reduction in income will also result in a reduction of purchasing power, which may cause contractions in consumption patterns. Next slide. But the disruptions of the COVID-19 crisis have also highlighted that there are many fragilities of contemporary food systems and many opportunities for change. These challenges include access to safe, nutritious food at affordable prices, the vulnerability of employees across the food system, and even the overall survival of firms and industries, particularly MSMEs. But as we've talked about, there's reason for optimism. Disruptions to food systems also create opportunities to drive longer-term transformation, including organizational and social innovation, low and high-tech innovation, digitalization, and other technologies to protect workers, consumers, and those engaged in the entire food value chain. If we are to maintain the aspirations of the Agenda 2030, building back better is really the only option. And therefore, some of the fundamental longer-term challenges to the sustainability of food systems still need to be overcome and factored into response and recovery plans. Next slide. In July, FAO shared our own COVID-19 response and recovery program. In fact, we identified 7 key global areas of action needed to ensure rapid and continued support to the most vulnerable, while anticipating the secondary repercussions of the virus. These include a global humanitarian response and our continued commitment to the short-term needs of those in need, data for decision-making, economic inclusion and social protections, trade and food safety standards, boosting smallholder resilience, preventing the next zoonotic pandemic, and food systems transformation. Each of these thematic areas represents to us specific country and regional needs, and a number reflect common interest with EU priorities, including agri-food systems transformation, trade, food loss and waste, research, innovation, and digitalization, and also the importance of a One Health approach. Next slide. So what more is needed? Our food and agriculture systems are facing many challenges, and COVID-19 has aggravated the situation even further. These are complex challenges that require complex solutions. Certainly, resource commitments of funding, knowledge, research, and expertise are needed. In a time of economic downturn, it will be a difficult period for resource mobilization as development budgets decline and more competing needs for the funding materialize. One way to address this is to continue to bring coordinated action to leverage high-level political, financial, and technical support to quickly respond to the COVID needs. In November, FAO, along with the government of Italy and other members, launched the Food Coalition. It is aimed to mobilize financial resources, innovation, and technical expertise, promote advocacy initiatives, and establish a neutral space for dialogue among diverse and key stakeholders as we build back better. Always important to building back better is also the importance of having enabling policies that bring the types of transformation most needed, the types of policies that have been discussed in some of the earlier sessions here today. I would also like to stress the great potential of innovation, social, institutional, and technological, that can provide effective solutions as well. Trade is always an essential enabler in fighting poverty and hunger and achieving more sustainable and resilient agri-food systems. We also need a collective effort and new forms of smart and targeted partnerships with a variety of stakeholders, including the private sector, in order to leave no one behind. And finally, we must look to delivering outcomes in our shared activities. The upcoming Food Systems Summit, planned for September 2021 on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York, is such an example. Organized by the UN Secretary General, there is a growing awareness of the key role that future food systems will play in the achievement of all SDGs. The summit provides a potentially transformative moment that can be used to identify game-changing solutions and generate greater alignment of actions and outcomes. Let me close by just referencing a few important collaborations between FAO and our European partners that are notable and are opportunities, I think, for shared success. We welcome the European Green Deal and its numerous instruments, such as the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategies, as valuable initiatives for food systems transformation. We also have a number of important institutional collaborations that are important to driving solutions and action. We hold a strategic dialogue with the EU Commission in early 2021. We've established and act as the Secretariat of the European Parliamentary Alliance Against Hunger and Malnutrition, which is incredibly active in placing the fight against hunger at the top of political discussions. And we have worked intensively with Croatia and Germany in their presidencies this year, and are already in contact with Portugal and Slovenia to join forces with the EU Council in 2021. And FAO and the EU also work closely to support rural Africa development. I would just close by saying that I'm not certain that we can ever make food and agricultural value chains crisis-proof. But I do agree with Florence that in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. We have a very important and pivotal decade ahead of us as we inch closer to 2030 and what is supposed to mark the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are not on track to get there. So now is the time to take stock, to learn lessons from this challenging year and all of its impacts, and to work harder and smarter together to ensure no one is left behind. Thank you very much, and I look forward to being a part of the remaining conversation with the distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you for setting the scene and also for painting a global picture, a rather grim one, I'm afraid, but that's also part of the unfortunate vulnerabilities that the crisis has not only unearthed, but probably accentuated. We will now look at more specific angles, and we will turn to our other speakers. I would like to start with Giovanni Guarneri. Giovanni, you're a farmer and you're also the representative of the cooperative world. You were clearly impacted by the crisis. How did you cope? What did you put in place?
Sì, eccoci, buongiorno. Innanzitutto io desidero portare la mia esperienza di mercato e di campo nel settore lattiero-caseario italiano cooperativo. Prego di partire con la presentazione. Desidero mettere in evidenza come il settore ha attraversato questa difficoltà. Se possibile chiedo alla regia di lanciare la presentazione.
No.
Perfetto, grazie. Inizio con una domanda che rivolgo a tutti voi e vi prego di rispondere poi alla termine della presentazione, vi darò il risultato. La domanda è: pensate che sul mercato italiano durante la crisi del coronavirus si sia consumato più formaggio o meno formaggio? Chi pensa che ne sia consumato di più nella chat inserisca A, chi meno B. Questa è una domanda molto importante per comprendere come il settore lattiero-caseario italiano ha attraversato la difficoltà. Prego la prossima slide, next slide please. Due parole sulla nostra organizzazione. La nostra organizzazione rappresenta in Italia 600 caseifici cooperativi, 26.000 allevatori e noi alla stalla raccogliamo il 65% del latte nazionale. Quindi abbiamo una presenza con un giro d'affari di 7 miliardi di euro, una presenza molto importante. Ovviamente la nostra presenza si qualifica principalmente nei prodotti DOP come il grana padano, il parmigiano reggiano, la fontina, l'asiago e il pecorino romano. Prego, slide successiva, next slide please. Naturalmente la crisi ci ha colpito e segna il 2020 in modo molto importante. Noi ci siamo trovati in pochissimo tempo ad avere il mercato del food service chiuso, quindi a perdere il 30% delle vendite nel settore lattiero-caseario e contemporaneamente in alcune zone, soprattutto le più colpite, abbiamo avuto delle assenze di personale fino al 25%. Questo ha creato nella prima fase una interruzione di fatto della catena alimentare, della supply chain, della catena di approvvigionamento. Quindi da una parte c'è stata la grande difficoltà di raccogliere tutto il latte alla stalla durante la crisi, dall'altra parte c'era l'impossibilità di dare sbocco ai prodotti trasformati, ammesso di avere il personale per poterli trasformare, perché nell'attività produttiva, come vedremo poi, si può fare smart working con molte funzioni, ma non con le funzioni che lavorano nei caseifici naturalmente o che lavorano nelle stalle. Naturalmente questo ha visto la cooperazione impegnata per fare lo sforzo massimo per raccogliere il latte e poterlo comunque trasformare. Dall'altra parte dobbiamo ricordare che ci sono state anche grandi difficoltà di approvvigionamento relativamente ai sistemi di sicurezza per i dipendenti, quindi mascherine per il personale, mascherine, guanti, e questo ha creato delle situazioni di rischio da una parte e di paura dall'altra. Qual è stato il risultato di queste grosse difficoltà che tra marzo, aprile e maggio hanno colpito? Next slide please. È stato il crollo dei prezzi dei prodotti lattiero-caseari più importanti, quindi qua vedete il crollo del prezzo del latte diciamo così industriale, il crollo del prezzo del latte alla stalla, una caduta del prezzo del latte del prezzo della crema e anche una caduta del prezzo dei formaggi. Nel grafico potete vedere il prezzo nel caso specifico del grana padano. Quindi la situazione è stata estremamente critica. Next slide please. D'altra parte, cosa è successo? È successo che nella distribuzione c'era bisogno di prodotto e quindi c'è stata una grande richiesta di prodotti alimentari. Quindi il fatto che la catena di approvvigionamento abbia avuto delle interruzioni ha creato perdite di valore per tutti gli anelli ed è stato un momento molto delicato. Però è stato affrontato. Next slide, please. Come è stato affrontato? Innanzitutto, come si può immaginare, c'è stata una grande crescita delle vendite attraverso i canali digitali nelle loro varie forme. Le percentuali sono molto importanti, 120, 130, 150% a seconda se si parla di home delivery, di click and collect o di e-commerce, e questo ha riguardato sia i punti vendita delle singole cooperative, ma naturalmente soprattutto la distribuzione. Next slide, please. E quindi abbiamo, diciamo così, messo in pratica tutte le pratiche che ci hanno permesso di affrontare, nonostante la ristorazione chiusa, nonostante le preoccupazioni, il nuovo scenario che si stava delineando. Naturalmente uno degli elementi fondamentali è stato quello di riorganizzare il lavoro in piccoli gruppi in modo da contenere eventuali focolai di malattia, chiaramente, di malattia. È stato molto importante anche applicare laddove possibile, quindi nelle funzioni commerciali, nelle funzioni amministrative e negli organi societari, parlo soprattutto delle cooperative più che della fase, diciamo, della produzione primaria, lo smart working. E poi c'è stata un'altra scelta molto importante. C'è stato lo sforzo di reindirizzare, di ricostruire i propri portafogli prodotti verso tutte quelle referenze che erano richieste dalla distribuzione, quindi o che potevano essere adatte all'e-commerce e alla home delivery, quindi piccole confezioni per famiglie, prodotti pronti all'uso, mentre tutte le produzioni legate al food service, quindi grandi pezzi, pezzature importanti, prodotti prelavorati, invece sono stati ridotti. Quindi un esempio per tutti, i prodotti a pasta filata base per pizza, per esempio, quelli sono prodotti che abbiamo dovuto abbandonare. Dall'altra parte invece sono cresciute le porzioni, sono cresciute le produzioni per il retail e per l'e-commerce, e questo adattamento ha comportato naturalmente uno sforzo organizzativo, ma ha dato dei risultati importanti in termini di riequilibrio all'interno della filiera. Next slide, please. Quindi di fatto in questa fase, diciamo così, di ripresa, la seconda ondata che ha, diciamo così, colpito il nostro paese tra il mese di settembre e il mese di novembre ci ha trovato più preparati, ci ha trovato organizzati. Quindi questo è stato un elemento molto importante, e dall'altra parte abbiamo anche colto l'importanza strategica dei prodotti lattiero-caseari. Consideriamo che i prodotti lattiero, alla base c'è sempre il latte che però può essere una bottiglia di latte fresco che va in crisi nelle vendite perché i bar non la comprano, perché la shelf life è troppo corta e il consumatore va al punto vendita o magari una volta alla settimana perché ha paura. Ecco, dall'altra parte però i prodotti lattiero-caseari significa anche formaggi alla base della cucina, significa prodotti con lunga scadenza, e quindi avere riadattato la capacità produttiva alle nuove esigenze di mercato ci ha permesso di ritrovare l'importanza e la centralità della produzione lattiera all'interno del mercato. Next slide, please. Quindi di fatto mi avvio alla conclusione. La conclusione di fatto qual è? Che innanzitutto abbiamo imparato che occorre mantenere i nervi saldi, perché siamo in una filiera molto importante e abbiamo la responsabilità di garantire l'approvvigionamento. Dall'altra parte abbiamo imparato che l'organizzazione del lavoro è alla base della gestione delle emergenze. Organizzazione del lavoro, quindi gestione del numero dei gruppi di persone che lavorano, il lavoro remoto, e anche la flessibilità del lavoro, quindi la capacità di poter con alla base un prodotto come importante come il latte, avere, diciamo così, diverse linee produttive. Dall'altra parte abbiamo potuto constatare anche l'importanza di raccogliere sempre il latte alla stalla, perché è un bene prezioso che serve per alimentare una filiera alimentare che è alla base della serenità della collettività. E poi abbiamo anche imparato l'importanza dei prodotti di marca e per noi l'importanza delle DOP, che sono un baluardo all'interno della politica comunitaria, ed è importante che le DOP abbiano un'identità importante. Quindi è importante destinare risorse per la notorietà e la conoscenza dei formaggi DOP soprattutto, perché il consumatore, quando si è trovato sul lineare dei punti vendita, ha scelto i prodotti con maggior notorietà, e prodotti come il grana padano e il parmigiano reggiano, DOP appunto a elevata notorietà, hanno riscontrato un grande successo. E l'altro aspetto che abbiamo imparato è anche legato all'importanza di prodotti con lunga shelf life e adatti a un'attività di e-commerce. Ora, quindi il risultato che io desidero, diciamo, trasmettere, ritornando e ripensando anche ai grafici che abbiamo visto, è che c'è stato un recovery, c'è stata una ripresa e un adattamento della filiera lattiero-casearia. Quindi la risposta esatta alla domanda era A, naturalmente, quindi più formaggio. Nel nostro settore in Italia, di fatto, durante la crisi abbiamo registrato aumenti a seconda delle categorie di prodotto di consumi che vanno dal 4 al 10%. Ecco. Questo è, diciamo così, il risultato. Io sono a disposizione per la prosecuzione della discussione. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Lonneke, at Deloitte, you've been looking at the big picture. You've been looking at agri-food supply chains in general throughout the crisis, throughout the year, I should say. What's your take on the current situation?
Thank you. Yes, indeed, we have. And I think there are a couple of important things to learn for the short term, but also for the longer term. And luckily enough, also some very nice opportunities. So let's turn to some of our slides. Yes. So turning to the first slide, like mentioned by Beth already, there are a lot of things that were already happening in the food industry. So there are a couple of challenges on the next slide that have been going on for a long time, significant changes that are very important to keep in this perspective as well, because that was already going on before COVID happened. So the enormous uplift of technologies led to a lot of successes also related to crop yield, for instance. The consumer awareness of where products are coming from, the focus on track and trace, but also the impact of the whole health dialogue in the food industry. And on top of that, also the uplift of awakening of the climate awareness. And so I think a lot of things were already happening in the food industry before COVID came along. And COVID was sort of the what came on top of that, and also what stress tested the supply chains. So immediate, from day one to day two almost, or at least that's how it felt, you could easily see where some of those supply chain weakening links in the value chain were going wrong, and you are in it together. So your value chain is as strong and as weak as each of the parts of the value chain, and that became very apparent immediately on. Turning to the next slide. So some of the things that we saw happening, and obviously it's fair to say that there are so many different parts of the different sectors in the food industry that everybody had their own challenges, and none probably has all, but it's and then the answer and the short-term and longer-term opportunities are very specific per sector. But from one, it very clearly visualized the fact that a supply chain and the visibility in the supply chain is actually quite limited. Shorter, more visible and smarter end-to-end supply chains is definitely one of the directions that we would see for the future. And when I talk about visibility, this is not only within your own organization. As mentioned, the value chain is as strong as all chains in that value chain. And that visibility goes as far as the suppliers of your supplier, all the way to the start of the value chain and all the way to the end customer. And all of that is equally important in sort of managing a crisis like COVID, but also for the future. And then another thing that became very early on very apparent is that decision making. We always had kind of the luxury from a supply chain perspective to have some decisions, especially where it was matching demand and supply, do that on a regular basis, maybe on a monthly basis, sometimes even on a quarterly basis. But immediately under COVID, the world is changing every day almost. And demand has had such a significant hit and such a significant difference in what kind of products were asked by customers compared to before, that immediate short-term timeline reactions were absolutely necessary. So more agility in the supply chain, more day-to-day decision making, more flexibility in decision and switching around resources from A to B, to actually as good and as best as possible react to the very different demand was very apparent early on as well. And I think from a supply chain fan at heart, like I am, one of the most important things to see was that supply chain used to be kind of a cost center. And over the COVID crisis, supply chain has become essential because no supply chain, actually no products to customers. So actually really running that supply chain as good as possible and having that under control became essential to how you as a company go through and navigate through COVID. So for a supply chain at heart, that is very valuable to see. Then looking at some of the individual impacts. From a sourcing perspective, obviously dependencies on certain suppliers, but also the region that supplier was located became very apparent early on. And so a little bit more diversification in your supplier base. Also rethinking globalization versus regionalization are some very relevant topics, and making sure you understand where the vulnerabilities are. And also in the midst of the crisis, really understand what you can do to actually resolve that. So relationships in that value chain, working together as an ecosystem is one of the most important ways to combat the crisis. And so really also making the choice, what are my key suppliers and who do I need to work with to reduce risk as much as possible early on is very important. And you saw a lot of initiatives where different parties in the value chain also actively work together because they realize that they can only fight this together. Then obviously labor, there has been in operations a strong labor reliance also in the food industry, and that could be all ways of labor reliance. It could be in a production environment, but also very much related to cross-border traffic and seasonal workers, and all of that became much more difficult. So be able to navigate that with a certain buffer in there, with flexibility to actually decide what is going to be produced where and what is going to be distributed from where, obviously had a massive impact. From a distribution point of view, as already mentioned, a lot of companies redesigned very quickly some of their business model. How am I going to make money? Who are my customers? How am I going to serve that? And all of that put a significant strain on the distribution channel. Then product portfolio also something that was very rapidly rethought as far as reinventing entire new products, but also rethinking the current product portfolio. So is the portfolio that we have now, is that suitable for the COVID-19 period? And do we need to have all those individual products? Do we need to have that complexity in packaging and ingredients? And what can we do to make that simpler and best suitable and better suitable for what customers are looking for at this point in time? Obviously all with safety in mind, but rethinking that has been a big topic as well. And then, as mentioned before, the e-commerce boom, I would say, boost has obviously put a very strong strain on the whole route to market topic as well. Also there, diversification of different sales channels, very important. Diversification of different ways of bringing products to your customers had a serious impact, and the relationship with clients. There's a very different relationship with your customers at this point in time compared to before and probably also after COVID-19. So where are some of the positives in this? So I think for me, very positive is that a supply chain used to be a minimum cost operation. And towards the future, we strongly expect that next to minimum cost, which will always be important, there will be another element that's going to be of essence, and that is how can you use your supply chain to differentiate yourself in the market? And then you look at topics like flexibility, agility, quality, reliance, basically de-risking your supply chain and making it something different than your competition versus only minimum cost. One of the very strong opportunities. You also will see some more significant rethinking of the product portfolio. And so if you look at the number of the profile of the customers that you will have after we all come out of COVID-19, you could probably see a difference between people who are hit, or countries even that are hit very heavily by COVID, and people who are hit less by COVID. And that might mean that some of that mid-segment of products, the mid-range prices, might be less in demand, where the real special products, the real value add, green, sustainable products might still be in demand, but also a very strong demand for more low cost price products. So a seriously thinking.
Sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to really wrap up because we're very, very tight with time, and you've already gone a little further than you were supposed to. So can you just give us a one-sentence conclusion?
Then I would leave it with that because that was my last point.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lonneke. Marcel, I'll turn to you now because we've just heard from Lonneke that in fact it's not just the agri-food sector that has had to change and adapt, but consumers have changed their attitudes as well during the crisis. And you're very well placed to take us through that because Rêver is a retail group, and as such it also has had to adapt to the new functioning of the food supply chain. How did you do it?
Ja, herzlichen Dank für die Einführung, herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Mein Name ist Marcel Weber. Ich verantworte den Eigenmarkeneinkauf Food und Near Food für die Rewe Group Deutschland mit Sitz in Köln. Ich freue mich sehr, jetzt Ihnen in den kommenden Minuten einige Aspekte aus unseren Corona-Erfahrungen vorstellen zu dürfen. Aber ich würde gerne starten mit einigen Key Facts zur Rewe Group, die Sie auf dem nächsten Chart sehen. Die Rewe Group ist ein genossenschaftlich strukturiertes Unternehmen mit in Summe mehr als 360.000 Mitarbeitern in den beiden Bereichen Handel und Tourismus. Wir sind im Bereich Handel mit Formaten aktiv in 10 EU-Ländern als auch in Russland, mit unterschiedlichen Formaten, auch mit unterschiedlichen Marken. Next chart, please. Und auf dem Chart, was Sie gleich sehen sollten, sind auch unsere Hauptmarken abgebildet, umsatzmäßig. Die größten sind Rewe, Penny und Billa. Could you please step on the next chart? Yeah, one more. Thank you. Ja, kurzer Exkurs noch zu unserer Sourcing-Strategie. Also grundsätzlich sourcen wir für unsere Formate global, aber mit einem deutlichen Schwerpunkt auf dem jeweils nationalen Beschaffungsmarkt unserer Landesgesellschaften, sodass wir in der Spitze bis zu 80% unserer vertriebenen Artikel aus dem jeweiligen heimischen Markt beschaffen. Darüber hinaus verfolgen wir in diversen Kategorien auch eine regionale Beschaffungsstrategie. Warum? Weil wir zum einen die Vorteile in der kurzen Lieferkette, aber auch in der Transparenz sehen und zudem es dem Kundenwunsch entspricht. Auch unsere genossenschaftliche Struktur in Deutschland mit mehr als 1500 selbstständigen Kaufleuten erlaubt uns neben der nationalen und regionalen Beschaffung auch eine lokale Beschaffung. Und auf eine der neuesten Entwicklungen in dem Zusammenhang möchte ich kurz eingehen. Und zwar ist es unsere Rewe-Lokalpartnerschaft. Die Rewe-Lokalpartnerschaft richtet sich insbesondere an kleinere Produzenten und Landwirte aus dem Umfeld unserer Märkte und erleichtert ihnen den Vertrieb ihrer Produkte direkt über unseren Markt und das auch in kleinen Mengen. Wir bündeln also in unserer Rewe-Lokalpartnerschaft all die erfolgreichen Maßnahmen der Vergangenheit und verfolgen stark das Ziel, den lokalen Bezug auch in Zukunft zu forcieren und auszubauen. Aber kommen wir nun zu unseren Erfahrungen und Auswirkungen aus der insbesondere ersten Corona-Welle im März und im April. Die erste Corona-Welle und auch die weltweiten Lockdowns brachten die unterschiedlichsten Probleme und Herausforderungen entlang der gesamten Lieferkette mit sich. Die Lieferketten waren extrem beansprucht, zum einen durch den höheren Bedarf im LEH, auf der anderen Seite fiel aber auch der Horeca-Sektor in der Nachfrage über Nacht quasi komplett zusammen. Und auch die nationalen und internationalen Logistikwege und Strukturen sind teilweise aus dem Tritt gekommen. In diesen Krisenzeiten kommen Schwachstellen in der Kette natürlich sehr schnell zum Vorschein. Und es gibt auch kein generelles Allheilrezept, was hilft, um diese Schwachstellen und Probleme zu lösen, sondern es bedarf einer fallbezogenen, schnellen und vor allen Dingen auch gemeinsamen Lösungsfindung. Und wir haben auch gesehen, dass die Probleme des einen auch die Chancen für alle sein kann. Wir haben während der vergangenen Monate mehrere Horeca-Artikel auch in unseren Märkten vermarkten können und haben damit nicht nur Food Waste vermieden, sondern auch den Druck von Einzelnen lindern können. Next chart, please. One more. Wenn wir nur noch einen Blick werfen auf, wie hat sich eigentlich die Nachfrage entwickelt in den ersten Wochen der Corona-Welle und mit dem Lockdown, so konnten wir Folgendes feststellen. Und zwar, dass sich in einigen Kategorien die Nachfrage analog entwickelt hat, und zwar in all unseren Landesgesellschaften. Zum Beispiel konnten wir überall eine gestiegene Nachfrage nach Grundnahrungsmitteln und Konserven feststellen. Auf der anderen Seite aber auch eine Kaufzurückhaltung in Warengruppen wie zum Beispiel Süßigkeiten oder Convenience. All diese Entwicklungen lassen sich auch erklären. Also für Convenience ist die Entwicklung beispielsweise oder die Erklärung beispielsweise die deutlich reduzierte Mobilität der Menschen, Homeschooling, aber auch vermehrt Homeoffice führt natürlich in diesem Bereich zu einer deutlich rückläufigen Nachfrage. Wenn wir uns allerdings nun die Top-Performer auf Artikelebene anschauen, so erkennen wir doch deutliche Unterschiede entlang unserer Landesgesellschaften. Und einige Beispiele habe ich Ihnen in dem unteren Teil des Charts dargestellt und transparent gemacht. Diese Beispiele sind aus unserem Discount-Bereich. Wir konnten aber darüber hinaus auch einen Trend hin zu mehr regionalen Produkten und Bio feststellen. Im ersten Augenblick sicherlich auch positiv beeinflusst durch Out-of-Stock-Situationen im Preiseinstieg, aber auch nach Stabilisierung der Lieferketten hält dieser Trend weiterhin an. Ja, dies in Kürze zu unseren Erfahrungen und next chart, please. Und lassen Sie mich schließen mit einigen ausgewählten Erfahrungen und Learnings. Die Erfahrungen der letzten Monate, die haben uns darin bestärkt, dass der eingeschlagene Weg, die kurzen Lieferwege und die Lokalpartnerschaften langfristig zu stärken, dass das genau der richtige Weg ist. Und ich möchte noch 3 weitere wichtige Elemente in diesem Zusammenhang erwähnen, und zwar dass der Dialog und das Gespräch auf Augenhöhe mit unseren Partnern, die langfristigen Verträge, um Planungssicherheit für alle Beteiligten auch sicherzustellen, und eine Omnichannel-Kommunikation, um den Kunden auch wirklich ideal zu erreichen. Darüber hinaus haben wir sehr viel Erfahrung gesammelt, wie wir mit den unterschiedlichsten Problemstellungen umgehen Wir haben gesehen, dass über allem die kurzen Lieferwege natürlich schon die stabileren sind und wir erwarten darüber hinaus eine weiterhin höhere Nachfrage nach regionalen Produkten und nach Bioprodukten. Ich danke Ihnen recht herzlich für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit und wünsche Ihnen allen eine sehr interessante Konferenz.
Thank you very much, Marcel, and thanks for being so sharply on time. Thank you very much. I'd like now to ask the opinion of the Commission and our Commission representative, Michael Scannell. Michael, the Commission also has learned lessons from this COVID crisis. Looking at the future, what are the perspectives in terms of food security?
Thank you, Florence. It's a privilege to speak on the Commission's experience and the lessons learned. And I'd start from a remark made by Commissioner Wojciechowski in his earlier presentation, where he highlighted with how we dealt with the COVID crisis as one of the landmark achievements of his first year in office. Because I think by any measure, the Commission did a very, very good job. We ensured that citizens continued to have safe, affordable, high-quality food on their plates. And that wasn't due to our own efforts alone. It was a collective effort. It reflected what we did working with member states, working with key stakeholders in basically ensuring that the food supply chain continued to operate efficiently and effectively. And we succeeded in ensuring that basically there was no crisis. Of course, we have to accept that there were specific sectors which did suffer. The nature of any crisis is that there will be damage done. But fundamentally, we didn't add a food security crisis to an existing existential public health crisis. And that was our priority throughout these very difficult months, that basically Europe couldn't afford to fight a crisis on two fronts, public health and food security. And I think we succeeded in ensuring that the primary focus could take place in relation to the public health dimension. And I think in that context, our food systems proved to be remarkably resilient. But I'd highlight, and this is an important lesson, that there's a very fine line between success and failure. Because there were moments, particularly in the early weeks and months of the lockdown, when we did risk basically outright panic. We all saw the images, the 60-kilometer queues, lines at the Brenner Pass, the supermarket shelves, empty of products, panic buying, etc., etc. But nonetheless, we managed to calmly, successfully deal with that and working very closely with the member states and stakeholders, basically ensuring stability and ensuring that the food supply chain could operate efficiently and effectively. And I think that was in large part due to the success of our internal market. It's very sophisticated, it's well established. We, the Commission, are credible in how we deal with problems. When there are risks or threats to that internal market, people trust us and have confidence that we'll take the EU interest and that we basically will ensure that fair balances are found between the competing interests. But perhaps most importantly, that safety and the protection of citizens will be the primary interest taken into account. But sticking with the issue of how fine a line it is between success and failure, I leave it to your imagination what the scenario might have been if, on top of the public health crisis, we had had a much bigger food security crisis. And that's an important lesson going forward, because we have to be very careful to ensure that there is no complacency. And in some respects, I think our success in dealing with the earlier phase of the crisis could potentially be our Achilles heel in how we might deal with crisis in the future. There's a real risk that people might simply assume that our food supply chains are resilient. They worked, they survived largely intact the COVID crisis, and that basically care and maintenance is sufficient for the future. And that, frankly, is not the message that we want to pass. To the contrary, and this is very clear in the Farm to Fork strategy, we have already highlighted that basically we need to ensure that our food systems become even more resilient, including in relation to outright risks to the operation of the food supply chain. And that explains why, for example, amongst the various initiatives in the Farm to Fork strategy is an undertaking to present a contingency plan on how we deal with future major disruptions to the food supply chain. And the Commission has already recently published its roadmap on how we bring that particular initiative forward, and would invite all stakeholders to take the opportunity to have a look at that roadmap and submit their views, and to already factor it in to their future planning. The roadmap obviously is only the beginning of the process. We will be engaging in further contacts with the member states and key stakeholders and developing an overall contingency plan, a forum on how we consult with member states, and basically trying to put in place a clear, transparent framework on how we deal with crisis in the future. In parallel, and more importantly, probably the single key initiative in the Farm to Fork initiative is an undertaking to fundamentally review our entire regulatory framework on sustainability. This is an initiative that will be presented in 2023. And that basically looks at the resilience of our system overall. And in that context, I think we need to look not only to potential crisis to the food chain per se, but how, for example, we deal with climate change. Because when we speak of crisis, we can speak of crisis that we know are going to emerge and risks to food security that might arise from food safety or animal health or plant health problems, et cetera, et cetera. But there are also crises that we know are already with us. And I think climate change is clearly one of those. So if we want to ensure that our food systems are in a position to keep our citizens fed with safe, affordable, high quality food, which I would remind people is a formal treaty obligation under Article 39 of our treaties, we basically need to fundamentally review our systems to ensure that they are indeed resilient and that they can, as an example, ensure that we are able to factor in the challenge of climate change to our food production systems. So I'd invite, again, all stakeholders to look in particular at the roadmap that I mentioned on the contingency plan and on the future framework on the sustainability of our food supply systems, because I think between them, they will be two key elements that will allow all our stakeholders in the food supply chain to ensure that we have a sound, resilient system that keeps our citizens safe and makes available to them good, high quality, affordable food. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm waiting to be back on screen just to make sure you hear me. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for giving us not only a view of what's happened, but also for informing us that indeed the Commission is already looking ahead at what might happen in the future, and particularly in case we're hit by new crises, which is unfortunately more than likely. I'd like to go back to two of our previous speakers, Marcel and Giovanni. You both told us about your experience, and you even said that you were better prepared. I think Giovanni said that you were better prepared for the second wave because you had time to plan things. So what would you need not to prevent, but to adapt to future crises? And maybe I'll start with you, Marcel.
Ja, ich kann das nur bestätigen. Wir waren natürlich für die zweite Welle auch viel besser vorbereitet und gut vorbereitet als in der ersten. Wir haben uns da relativ schnell angepasst und die Organisation und die Teams haben auch gezeigt, dass sie krisenfest sind und dass sie sich schnell an die Krise auch anpassen konnten. Ich möchte an der Stelle auf Ihre Frage folgendermaßen antworten. Ich glaube, wir sollten folgenden Aspekt nochmal beleuchten. Also wir sind große Befürworter des EU-Binnenmarktes und sehen auch da die großen Chancen und Vorteile, aber wir sollten an der Stelle auch die regionalen Strukturen nicht vergessen. Und wir sehen da auch keinen Widerspruch. Wir glauben, dass starke regionale Strukturen auch die EU stärken. Und ein Impuls, wir glauben auch, dass die Anforderungen seitens der Politik auch leistbar sein müssen für unsere kleineren Produzenten und für die Landwirte. Denn ein starker Mittelstand sorgt auch für Vielfalt für die Verbraucher und ich denke, das wollen wir auch alle erhalten. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Giovanni, what would you need to put in place to prepare for future crises? And if I can ask you to make it a very short answer.
Sì, molto brevemente. Innanzitutto, dal punto di vista aziendale, come trasformatori, abbiamo bisogno di sviluppare delle politiche di diversificazione delle nostre produzioni, perché solo attraverso la diversificazione si riesce a mediare e gestire il rischio. Diversificazione significa diversificazione di prodotto, ma anche di canale. Infatti, ben ricordava prima Marcel Weber che insomma il canale dove opera la sua catena distributiva ha avuto degli importanti risultati e quindi è importante diversificare. Ma desidero fare una considerazione più generale rivolgendomi soprattutto a Michael Scannell. Una filiera, una catena di approvvigionamento che funziona e che ha dimostrato come nei fatti che è riuscita a garantire il flusso di prodotti alimentari ha alla base un'agricoltura professionale, un'agricoltura che rispetta e si evolve sotto il profilo del benessere animale, che è attenta all'ambiente ma è professionale e quindi è un'agricoltura che ha nell'attività produttiva, zootecnica ma cerealicola, un approccio imprenditoriale e questo è molto importante ed è importante che la comunità europea nelle sue politiche tenga ben presente che valore aggiunto, impegno della manodopera e utilizzo dei fattori della produzione sono alla base di un'agricoltura che riesce a sostenere una filiera che resiste anche a situazioni di crisi. Chiaramente in un contesto ovviamente di massima attenzione per l'ambiente, di miglioramento nella sua capacità di utilizzare i fattori della produzione e soprattutto nelle filiere zootecniche sappiamo essere importanti. Grazie.
Thank you, Giovanni. I will come back to Michael in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to ask Lonneke for your point of view. What would you advise clients to put in place in order to face future crises? Lonneke, and please also a very short answer.
First of all, I think it's really important to understand what is here to stay. So where do we need to invest? Because it's going to be fundamentally different towards the future than it has been in the past. And then I think the most important that we see is a level of acceleration of digital solutions, better use of information, transparency and visibility, to actually be able to react very agile, very on a day-to-day basis to significant changes.
Thank you. So, Michael, I will turn back to you. We've heard some suggestions and some comments and flexibility, adapting the breeding world. What can the Commission do to help or answer these challenges that have been raised by our speakers?
I think I partly answered it earlier. It's to ensure that we have a credible, sound, flexible, transparent regulatory framework that allows our traders to move their goods throughout Europe, basically safely and without unnecessary impediment. And equally, if even more importantly, allows our consumers to be confident that these products are safe and are produced to acceptable standards. And as I highlighted earlier, our system has already proven to be very resilient in that respect. The biggest risk that I would see, and I highlighted it, is that we would become complacent and assume that because we've successfully managed one crisis, although frankly the COVID crisis continues, that essentially the system doesn't require any further work. But the Commission is not complacent in that respect. I already highlighted that we have a number of initiatives underway so that we learn from this crisis, that we improve on our existing framework, and that we become even more flexible in relation to the future, and that we basically take better account of new emerging risks and threats but that we equally don't forget existing known risks and threats. And there I highlight in particular the risk from climate change. That already, if we don't successfully address it, will seriously call into question the resilience of our existing systems. So it's something we already know and must acknowledge needs to be decisively challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that as a wrap-up point, we will leave our speakers with some food for thought, because we will now turn to our audience for our first and only Slido question. I'm afraid we do not really have time to have the two we had foreseen. So I would like to ask all of you watching us to connect to slido.com and join the Agri Outlook hashtag, click on day 1, and your question will come up. I hope you have had time to connect. There we are. So, what do we need to be ready for the next crisis? You tell us. All the things that come to your mind. We've heard all sorts of words. We've heard indeed shorter chains. We've heard resilience. We've heard flexibility. Yes. So we'll give you a few more seconds. I see things like mobilization, communication coming up, innovation, cooperation. Well, clearly, I think that flexibility, shorter chains, innovation, cooperation and communication are catching up. But innovation, shorter chains and flexibility are definitely the things that come up most. So I hope that our speakers will take that as food for thought, because I'm afraid we don't have time to continue our exchange with them, but I'm sure you will hear some further solutions during the coming days. I would like to thank all of you for listening to us, and particularly thank our speakers for sharing with us their views and their experience this afternoon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you continue to follow the upcoming sessions. Thank you. And I put my mask back.
I am the fabulous master event. Actually, first of all, the ladies and gentlemen at home can see the great work of our graphic artist. I'm very glad you put that there, because he is beavering away ferociously and creatively behind the scenes. And there you can see some of the output. So we'll just let that run a little while, just for a moment. So don't, of course, forget, ladies and gentlemen, that you can see the outputs of his great work in that 3D gallery. So I hope that you can hear me very well. And just to say a huge thank you to Florence, because it isn't an easy job doing these hybrid events, is it? You can't see who you're talking to, and you've got the interpretation coming at you down a speaker. I'm not surprised to see the shorter chains there. That's something very much that the Commissioner emphasised. And what I particularly heard there was, I think, from your very, very first speaker, if I tie it back to the title, Never Let a Food Crisis Go to Waste, I think your first speaker said COVID-19 has highlighted the fragilities of our contemporary food systems, but of course created opportunities to drive long-term transformation. So we've had that word optimism. You mentioned it at the outset. Do you come out of that first session there feeling there is an optimism?
Yes, absolutely. I think not only is there optimism, but there's a will to really continue working on all the measures that have already been taken so that we anticipate future problems. And I think that's a positive message, you know?
Yes. And also, and I heard there very much from the Commission, we're not going to be complacent.
No.
That was the very, very clear word that I heard. Right, it is your chance now to literally, well, put your feet up if you wish, because you have a lot to do tomorrow. I'll be seeing you again then, but I thank you so much for breaking the ice in that first session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Florence Ranson.